Filet mignon is the most expensive steak in the case and the least interesting thing on the animal, and the people charging $60 for it know that. I have been a butcher for 40 years, and I will tell you what they will not. There is a muscle on this animal that ranks second in tenderness across the entire carcass. Behind the tenderloin and nothing else. It costs a fraction of what filet sells for, and the reason you have never seen it in a grocery case has nothing to do with quality. It has to do with arithmetic. Restaurants figured that out long ago and have been buying this cut before it reaches you ever since. 4 things covered here: what the muscle is, what to call it at a counter, how to trim it, how to cook it. The reason you do not know it yet is not your fault. The teres major sits beneath the shoulder blade, inside the chuck primal, the shoulder, the same part of the animal that produces pot roast, stew meat, and most of what goes into the grinder. Nobody expects tenderness from the chuck, which is exactly why this muscle has stayed hidden inside it for so long. Its official designation is NAMP 1114F, and if that means nothing to you, it means everything to the people who buy beef professionally. The mechanism is simple. This muscle stabilizes the shoulder against opposing forces, which sounds like hard work and is almost none at all. Low use means the fibers stay fine, the connective tissue stays minimal, and the muscle never builds the density that makes a cut chew. Tenderness in beef is not a mystery. It is a record of how hard the muscle worked. The shank worked hard. The flank worked hard. The chuck roast around this muscle worked hard. This one did not. Each animal yields exactly 2 teres major muscles, 1 per side, running about 12 to 16 ounces each, 14 on average. Combined weight off the whole animal is roughly 1 to 1¼ pounds. On a steer that yields hundreds of pounds of beef, that is almost nothing. It is also lean, around 5 grams of fat per 100 grams of meat. Everything unusual about this cut, including the price, including the fact that you cannot find it, flows from those 2 numbers. Small yield, difficult extraction. That is the whole explanation. The reason this cut never reaches the grocery case is not a conspiracy. It is a spreadsheet. Industrial meat breakdown runs on yield per minute of labor, and that calculation is ruthless. A butcher breaking down a rib primal produces a ribeye or a strip because those cuts are large, defined by bone structure, and obvious to anyone trained for a week. The teres major is buried inside the shoulder clod, small, irregularly shaped, and surrounded by muscles that look similar to an untrained eye. Freeing it cleanly requires someone who knows exactly where it is and how to get there without destroying it. That person costs money, and the muscle weighs 14 ounces. The math does not work for a processing line moving hundreds of animals a day, so it gets pushed into the grind with everything else in the neighborhood, and nobody at the plant loses sleep over it. That is the industrial half of the answer. The other half is restaurants. The teres major that does get extracted, mostly at smaller operations and specialty houses, is largely purchased by restaurant buyers before it ever reaches a consumer counter. They have known what this muscle is for years. They plate it as a feature cut, charge accordingly, and rely on the fact that their customers have never heard the name. I watched this happen from behind the counter for a long time. The scarcity you run into trying to find this cut is not natural. It is the entirely predictable result of 2 industries making rational decisions for themselves. The University of Nebraska ranked the muscles of the beef carcass by tenderness, not a marketing study, not a claim invented by somebody with product to move. Measured research, conducted on actual tissue, producing an actual ranked list. The teres major came in second, across the entire animal. Behind the tenderloin, which is the source of filet mignon, and behind nothing else. Every other muscle on the steer sits below it. That ranking matters here because the beef industry runs on marketing language, and marketing language has trained most people to associate tenderness with price and price with quality, as though those 3 things were the same measurement. They are not. Second place on that list is not a consolation prize. The mechanism is the same one described in the anatomy. Fine fibers, minimal connective tissue, a muscle that spent its life doing almost nothing. The result is a texture close enough to tenderloin that most people eating it blind would not confidently name the gap. Now the honest part, because this channel does not oversell. Second is not first. Tenderloin still wins on pure tenderness, and anyone telling you this cut is identical to filet mignon has not eaten them side by side with any attention. What second place means in practice is that the gap is narrow enough to be irrelevant to most palates, while the price gap between them is not narrow at all. That asymmetry is the entire point of this video, and it is not a matter of opinion. The name you want at a butcher counter is petite tender. That is the retail term, coined by the Beef Checkoff program's muscle profiling study in the early 2000s, an effort to identify and name the underused muscles buried in the carcass before they all disappeared into the grinder permanently. It is the term most likely to get a nod of recognition from someone standing behind a case. If petite tender draws a blank stare, try shoulder tender. If that fails, say teres major. A butcher who recognizes the third term is a butcher worth driving across town for. Other names exist: chuck tenderloin, chuck petite filet, beef shoulder petite filet. And you may encounter any of them, depending on where you shop and who did the labeling. Now the correction that matters most, because this mistake is common enough to cost you the whole trip. Mock tender is a different muscle. It sits above the shoulder blade. The teres major sits below it. The names are similar, the location is close, and the similarity ends there. Mock tender is a braising cut. It is tough, it is fibrous, and no amount of high heat in a cast iron pan will change that. If someone hands you mock tender when you asked for petite tender, you're holding the wrong piece of meat, and cooking it like the right one will confirm it in the worst possible way. Check the label. Ask again. The distinction is not subtle once you know it exists. Filet mignon at retail runs $30 to $60 a pound. At a restaurant, that number climbs further before the plate reaches the table. The teres major, when you can find it, commonly runs $10 to $18 a pound, with ranges cited as high as $22 to $24 in some markets. Confirmed sales exist at just over $5 a pound at retail and as low as $4.99 at a university meat lab. The $6 in the title is a real price that real people have paid. It is not a national average, and I will not pretend otherwise, because regional variation on this cut is significant, and anyone flattening that into a single number is selling something. What is consistent across every market is the gap. Less than half the price of filet mignon for what informed reviewers put at 85 to 90% of the eating experience. That is not a small gap on either side of the equation. Now the mechanism behind filet's price, because it is not what most people think. Tenderloin is expensive because demand for it is enormous and the muscle is physically small. One tenderloin per side, and most of it goes to restaurants before you see it. The price tracks scarcity compounded by decades of reputation building. Reputation is a real thing, and it is also a thing you can opt out of. The teres major has no reputation yet. That is a problem for the people selling it and an advantage for everyone buying it. The texture is fine-grained, close to tenderloin, soft without going mushy. The finish is buttery in the way that lean, tender muscle reads on the palate when nothing has gone wrong in the cooking. That is the honest description, and it holds up. Now the part that separates this cut from filet in a way that actually favors it. The teres major carries slightly more flavor, more umami depth, more presence in the mouth, a beef character that the tenderloin, for all its tenderness, does not quite deliver. The mechanism is the neighborhood. Tenderloin sits in the loin, isolated, barely connected to anything that works hard, and its mildness is the direct consequence of that isolation. The teres major sits inside the chuck, surrounded by muscles that do real work, and it absorbs that environment without doing the work itself. The result is a cut that is nearly as tender as filet and more interesting to eat. That is a defensible claim, not a sales pitch. Do not expect them to taste identical, because they do not, and anyone telling you otherwise has not paid attention at the table. What you can expect is that the difference in tenderness is small enough that most people would not identify it blind, while the difference in flavor runs the other direction. Then the practical advantage the tenderloin cannot match. This cut is more forgiving. Slightly overcooked, it stays tender. Filet at 145 degrees becomes expensive cotton. This one gives you a margin. It is rarely in a standard grocery case, and if you walk into a supermarket and ask for it by any of its names, the person behind the counter will most likely look at you the way people look at a word they have never seen written down. That is not an insult to them. It is a consequence of everything covered in Section 2. You need a butcher who knows the extraction or a supplier who ships. On the sourcing side, Creekstone Farms, Snake River Farms, Porter Road, and Wild Fork Foods have all carried it. That list is not exhaustive, and availability shifts, so call ahead rather than assuming. At a counter, ask for petite tender first. That is the term most likely to land. Shoulder tender if it does not. Teres major if you want to know whether the person you are talking to actually knows their way around a carcass. A butcher who recognizes that third term without hesitation is worth remembering by name. Set your expectations on supply before you go looking. 2 muscles per animal means small lots, inconsistent availability, and no guarantee the shop has it the day you want it. Buy it when you see it rather than when you plan the meal. One more thing before the cutting board, the muscle almost always arrives with silver skin still on it. Removal is skilled labor, and at this price point, nobody is doing it for you in advance. That is the next thing to cover, and it matters more than most people expect. Silver skin is connective tissue, not fat, and the distinction matters because fat renders and silver skin does not. Heat tightens it. As the muscle warms in the pan, the membrane contracts, and a cut that should lie flat and cook evenly starts to curl and bunch. On a tender muscle this small, that is enough to ruin the cook before it finishes. Remove it first, every time, without exception. Chill the meat before you start. Cold firms both the muscle and the membrane and lets the silver skin separate cleanly from the tissue underneath instead of tearing through it. Pat the surface completely dry so your knife hand and your offhand both have grip. Slide a sharp knife under the membrane at one end, just enough to get purchase. Then angle the blade slightly upward toward the silver skin rather than down into the meat. That upward angle is the entire technique. With the blade pointed down, you lose meat. Pointed up, you lose membrane. Skim it off in one continuous pass, keeping the blade flat and moving steadily rather than sawing. If it tears, start again at the edge of the tear. Trim any heavy fat cap you find, but leave a thin layer behind. This cut is lean enough that you cannot afford to take everything. That thin layer of fat is flavor, and it is also insurance against a dry finish. 5 minutes of work. A restaurant charges you for this in the margin between what the muscle cost them and what the plate costs you. Pull the meat from the refrigerator 30 minutes before it goes near heat. A cold center in a small muscle means the outside overcooks before the inside arrives, and this cut is too lean to absorb that mistake. Cast iron, preheated until water beads and dances on the surface. High smoke, point oil. 3 to 4 minutes per side until the crust is deep brown and has released. The crust is flavor and nothing else. It does not seal anything inside the meat, and that idea has been wrong for as long as it has been repeated. A thermometer is not optional equipment here. The muscle is small and lean, and the window between right and ruined is narrow enough that guessing will cost you the cut more often than not. Pull at 130 degrees for medium rare, 140 for medium. Some cooks pull as early as 125 for a rarer finish, and carryover brings it the rest of the way. Past 145, the fibers tighten, moisture leaves, and the tenderness that justified the whole exercise simply disappears. Rest 10 minutes minimum, better 15 to 20. Cutting early moves the juice from the muscle to the board, and there is not enough fat in this cut to compensate for that loss. Slice against the grain, perpendicular to the fibers. Medallions are the alternative, crosswise cuts seared like individual fillets. But they cook faster and demand considerably closer watching. The reason you have never eaten this cut has nothing to do with quality, and everything to do with the fact that grinding it was easier than teaching someone where to find it. That is still true today, which is why it sits in the grinder at most processing plants and on the menu at restaurants that are not telling you what they are actually serving. The meat case is not a ranking of quality. It is a ranking of what is convenient to sell, and those two lists have never been the same. Filet Mignon is not a lie. It is an expensive habit built on a name and maintained by people who benefit from you keeping it. Subscribe if you want the rest of what 40 years behind the counter teaches you. Next time, I am showing you the cut that every whole animal butcher hides for himself.